Thank you for waiting, everyone. Our fifth session is Complex Challenges of Security and Climate Change, Understanding Interconnections and Chartering Future Responses. In the age of the Anthropocene, we are searching for collective solutions and universal values to address complex risks and ensure humanity's survival. That requires examining the interconnections among various fields of inquiry. In this session, leading scholars will pursue the pathways to creating an equitable and sustainable future. Our moderator is Nazia HUSSAIN, Assistant Professor of the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. Her work focuses on complex stresses, especially those related to politics and governance of urban water supplies in developing countries. So, Professor HUSSAIN, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miki-san. Thank you for joining us in the panel titled Complex Changes of Security and Climate Change. With me, I'm very, very honored to welcome my three esteemed colleagues, Professor Jae-Seung Lee, Jean Monnet Chair, and Professor at Korea University, Professor Kohei Saito, who works at the University of Tokyo, and Professor Lisa SCHIPPER from the University of Bonn. So without further ado, let me just very quickly explain why we're here. Slide, please. So the images are from the latest IPCC report. We are living in the age of anthropogenic climate change, which in simple words, what it means is that we're learning to live with the effects of climate change. We are not, we may think of future scenarios, but the fact is that we are coping with these changes. These changes are important to pay attention to because in a hyper-connected world, these disturbances do not remain localized. And so in that sense, when we think of climate change confronting humanity as a species at a time when the world is deeply interconnected, the question then is, how do we make sense of it? How do we address it? So essentially what our goal in this panel is to highlight how local and global players are responding to the implications of climate change-related risks, how local and global political economies are reorganized to counter or at least survive its destructive effects, and how societies and vulnerable populations around the world may adapt to these challenges. We believe that if we map these steps, it may determine the present and the future of the world. So simply, the scope of this 1-hour conversation is to identify the scope of the problem and then, if possible, identify the scope of the solution. This is important because we are seeing divisions within societies and among societies along economy, politics, and ideology. So if we figure out what our next steps may be, perhaps we may be able to identify pathways to equitable and sustainable futures. With this very brief intervention, I will now request Professor Jae-Seung Lee to maybe explain to us the nature of climate responses in a hyper-globalized world, also considering the contemporary geopolitical realities.
All right. Thank you, Nazia. Well, over the past decades, scientists and policymakers have been very diligently working on bringing climate change agenda to the center of global debate. And we have made some progress. And now we are agreeing on several things. Is climate change real? Yes, it is real. And it's man-made, human-made crisis is getting deeper. Second, is the crisis urgent? Yes, it is urgent and it is serious. Maybe a lot more serious than we think. And the third question, are we doing enough? And answer is no. We may have to move faster, especially to meet 1.5 degree target. Okay, so we are agreeing on several things. But there is another dimension to look at, the climate change issues. That is climate change geopolitics. And the question is, are we in a cooperation path or colliding path in climate change geopolitics in which the countries, states, are competing over their political and economic interests? So let's get started and see what is at the stake and what we should do from now. Slide, please. Okay, climate change has a multiple dimension. It is not just one unitary concept. We have environmental dimension, we have political dimension, economy dimension, and human life dimension. And unfortunately, these four angles do not overlap identically. So we have many different overlaps and many different peculiarities. Have to face it. Second, there are many contradicting elements within the discussion of climate change. Science versus morality. We are talking about science. At the same time, we are talking about the ethics and green virtue. We are talking about the role of the state and the role of individual. We are talking about regulation, environmental regulation, but some other people may want to pursue more development, industrialization. Some bottom-up voluntary measure or mandatory regulation from top-down measure. So policy side, civil society side, that is actually another contradicting element. Decarbonization with nuclear or decarbonization without nuclear. Nowadays, that is a hot debate too. And lastly, but not leastly, there is a gap between rhetoric and reality. We talk about green, we talk about climate change, but reality, political reality, economic realities may not be that smooth, that rosy. So we have to face another inconvenient truth. And another inconvenient truth is going green may not be so peaceful. Old question and blame game. Who is responsible? Should we look at the present emitter, like China, US, or past emitter, the UK, Europe, and the United States, or future emitter? How common and how differentiated responsibility to be shared, and what is fair there? We are still wondering. Global competition is going on between developed country and developing countries. Yesterday, as Jeffrey Sachs mentioned, US versus China, competition is going on. Europe, United States versus emerging economies is going on. Net zero pledge. It's glad to see that a lot of people are converging on net zero, but legal compliance issue, monitoring, regulation, still they are controversial. We have a long way to go to meet 1.5 degree target, but do we have a climate leadership? Does the United States have strong commitment? Is the European leadership strong enough? Or other Japanese, Korean, and other leadership? Or international organization? We always carry question mark. China might be a game changer, it's a big player, but we are still wondering whether China will be a competitor or partner. Market is growing, carbon market is growing, ETS, voluntary market, but who is controlling the market? And we are also adding another question mark. Green financing, very important. One group of people say fund is not enough. Another group of people will say governance is not enough. I don't want my donation to be wasted. Who is right? Maybe both of them may be right or may be wrong. But we need to do something on green financing too. Environment has a sharper edge. Nowadays, carbon is becoming a trade barrier and also a litigation case. So the carbon war may be coming. And that is where climate change geopolitics lie. So I'm leading to my conclusion page. The three messages. First, beware of the hidden teeth of carbon agenda. It may sound too pessimistic, but green is not always peaceful, and there exists a tension between legitimacy of climate change and the implementation of decarbonization. Second, we have to be moral, but a morality does not guarantee the compliance of stakeholders, nor the money. Okay? And third, how to bring then a positive sum game structure in the climate governance. We have to see some optimistic exit. And I highlight two keywords. One is inclusiveness. Don't let climate change to be handled in the hands of the government. I'm not saying government is bad or evil, but they have to be joining in the spiral of climate geopolitics. So we have to bring more stakeholders, private sectors, and civil society here. Second, keyword, solution. We need more solution. Not just target issue, not just compliance issue, but we need more solution, and we are at a stage of finding that solution. So I will stop my presentation here, and we'll continue solution part in the second round.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee, for this very, very thoughtful and disturbing recap of where we find ourselves. This helps us make a segue to topic 2. And in that, I guess the question then arises, if considering climate change and responses, keeping in view the geopolitical realities is such a tough job, could we perhaps transcend borders and think of the commons and protecting the commons and think beyond borders? And in that, perhaps, could we change our consumption and production patterns? And in that, I would request Professor Kohei Saito to tell us, are we able to protect the commons under the current economic order?
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Kohei Saito. I'm very glad to be able to attend this conference today because I'm actually a very heterodox scholar. I'm a Marxist and a socialist. I'm teaching at the University of Tokyo, but I'm very happy that I'm gaining some recognition from my colleagues, and I'm able to speak here. And today, as a Marxist, highlight 2 points. One is the failure of COP. Not just COP27 just happened in Egypt, but I want to problematize the COP in general as the UN climate conference. The second point is, as answering to your question, all the solutions to climate crisis without challenging capitalist mode of production will be mere delusion. So that's the 2 points that I want to highlight in my lecture and provocate some thought. Slide, please. So the first point, let me stand up. My eyes, I can't see my own slides. So as we all know, we have to really urgently need to reduce the carbon emission roughly by half by 2030, and we must achieve the net zero emission by 2050. But in the last 20 years of COP, the emission of greenhouse gases kept increasing in the last 30 years. And there is no mention of reducing fossil fuels even in the last COP final agreement documents. So if we take this reality seriously, we can say that the 1.5 degrees Celsius target is not something we can achieve as long as we hold on to this paradigm and the order of that pivot around the COP. So I even say that all the progresses and success of the previous COPs, celebrated by the politicians themselves, media, and even scholars and some environmental movements and organizations, are mere delusions, because it is not achieving the goal that we are supposed to achieve, right? So we have to begin from this harsh reality. We cannot begin by denying the brutal fact. But I think it's high time to critically reflect upon this failure of COP. Otherwise, 2 degrees Celsius target will be also surpassed near future. We have to avoid this, at least. Then we have to try something new that is radically different from the COP. That is why recently we have the slogan all over the world, especially from the young generation, system change, not climate change, because the existing system cannot offer a solution. Then the solution must come from outside of the system. And this is why I see some possibility of reviving the idea of socialism. And now today, even Thomas Piketty is talking about socialism. However, of course, I am aware that such a radical call for system change has been marginalized. And I would even say that the myth of green capitalism is still dominant, despite a call for a great reset. Because according to this story, there are a lot of new opportunities, like electric vehicles and renewable energies, and those huge opportunities for massive investment can revive our economy, and we can even grow more. But that will happen in a sustainable manner, because technological innovations will decouple greenhouse gas emissions from economic growth. But as many people pointed out, this is not happening, at least in a way that is expected. It is not fast enough, first of all. And secondly, because of the ecologically unequal exchange of labor, resources, and environmental damages between the global north and global south, it is reasonable to assume that this kind of the current way of green growth could even worsen economic inequality and strengthen the monopoly by a few and land grabbing in global south. And this is not something that we want to do, even if we can decarbonize our society at the cost of the green global south. So answering to your question, if we can protect commons, and the ultimate global commons is the earth, under the capitalist model production, my answer is, of course, no. I want to ground this claim by going back to the Marx theory of primitive accumulation. I'm not going over all the section of primitive accumulation in Capital, but his point is very roughly said, capitalism is created by violent process of destroying the commons. And more generally, capitalism as a system of commodification is a system of creating scarcity by dissolving the commons that people were able to access without the mediation of money and commodity. And with the development of capitalism, increase of private riches, private wealth, is accompanied by the decrease of public wealth, or the commons. And the dissolution of the commons, lands, forests, and the water, and the creation of artificial scarcity through planned obsolescence, privatization, and branding, advertisement, and these are all the essential parts of capital accumulation. So as the capitalism develops, we have more artificial scarcity created by monopoly and the privatization, and all those things will actually rather diminishes the commons and other forms of public wealth. So I'm not advocating for overcoming natural scarcity. Of course, there are various natural limits. As Locke Strom said, there are planetary boundaries which we must respect. But we can actually abandon or try to at least partially overcome the social scarcity created by this system of artificial scarcity. As long as we hold on to this system of privatization, we cannot rather overcome this process of destroying the commons. So let me conclude. This is why I believe that we need to make the transition towards eco-socialist growth. If capitalism is fundamentally based on the creation of artificial scarcity, the protection and revival of the common is not possible under the current economic order, namely capitalism. But the Center for Global Commons at the University of Tokyo does not mention this point, as if we can revive the common without changing capitalism. I want to highlight this point. But if we can actually reverse the order, the capitalism is growing by dissolving the private wealth, or by dissolving the public wealth for the sake of increasing private wealth. We can reverse this order. We can create more public wealth at the cost of private wealth. And then, liberated from the pressure of artificial scarcity, the compulsion for people to compete for ever-increasing productivity would wither away. We would not have to feed our time and energy into the juggernaut of ever-increasing production, consumption, and ecological destruction. And this is what eco-social degrowth aim after for the sake of rehabilitating commons. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Saito, for this very provocative intervention. It's a nice segue to our topic 3. Your presentation made me think about inherent inequalities produced by economic order under the neoliberal dynamics. And it makes me wonder if pre-existing inequalities are deepening and how societies and governments may be able to adapt to climate change and how they are adapting to climate change. The latest IPCC report mentions that the brunt of climate change is being borne by marginalized and vulnerable populations. And here I would request Professor Lisa Schipper to tell us, are countries around the world able to adapt effectively? What are the costs of not getting it right? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I just want to say that, unfortunately, I am going to just probably add more negative type of comments on top of what you've already heard. I mean, I think from the adaptation perspective, things are also hitting limits. So I want to thank you for inviting me, because I think that the idea of bringing together science and philosophy is really critical to be able to figure out the solutions, as we talked about. There's no single disciplinary perspective that's sufficient to be able to answer all the questions that we have. So as Nazia said, I had the honor of being part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6 Assessment Report as a coordinating lead author of Chapter 18 in Working Group 2, which is Climate Resilient Development Pathways. And if I could have slide 1, please. No, slide 2, sorry. Thank you. And the report is really clear about this. The cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. And any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And just if you're interested, this is the final statement in the summary for policymakers by Working Group 2. I want to highlight 2 things in this statement. First, that the window of opportunity is closing rapidly. That means urgency, the word that you've already heard. Second, if we want to secure a livable and sustainable future for all, And that's the goal. And if we only cared about some, that window of opportunity would probably stay open for longer. What does this mean in terms of action then? One of the key findings in the Working Group 2 report is about adaptation. And the report draws on knowledge that outlines that the challenges we face and how they'll increase at higher warming levels show that, are we adapting well to climate change? And what we show is that action has increased, but progress is uneven, and we're not adapting fast enough. And the report was looking at science that had assessed that at least 170 countries and cities around the world have adaptation policies or planning, some sort of plan in place. But there are increasing gaps between adaptation action taken and what's needed. And these gaps are the largest among the lower income populations. So at the current rate of planning and implementation, these adaptation gaps will continue to grow. The late Archbishop Desmond Tutu talked about adaptation apartheid, where certain countries and regions were receiving more funds to support adaptation activities, but others were being excluded. Slide 3, please. So when we look at funding for adaptation, here this graph is taken from the latest UN Environment Programme Adaptation Gap Report that came out just a few weeks ago. What we see here is that the funding for climate action has certainly increased since 2012. And in blue is the proportion of that funding that is for adaptation. And this is both encouraging and discouraging at the same time. It's encouraging because, of course, the need is tremendous. But it's discouraging because increasingly research shows that adaptation is not an endless game. And here is where I'm laying all additional sort of depressing thoughts. The IPCC Working Group 2 report was really clear that there are limits to adaptation. Adaptation can't prevent all losses and damages, and even with effective adaptation, limits will be reached with higher levels of warming. So what we see is, particularly in natural systems, these ecosystems will no longer survive above 1.5 degrees of warming, above pre-industrial levels. That's average warming. And above 1.5, what we see in small islands is that freshwater availability decreases significantly to the point where people can no longer live there. So this is basically a limit, a hard limit, we say, because it's something that we just can't do anything about. When we then hit 2 degrees and further, there are a lot more limits that appear, but we're very close to 1.5 right now. Next slide, please. The other part of this is that many adaptation projects are actually increasing vulnerability to climate change rather than reducing it. And this is what we call maladaptation. It's basically adaptation that backfires. A 2001 definition, so that's more than 20 years ago, definition by the IPCC was that maladaptation is an adaptation that does not succeed in reducing vulnerability, but increases it instead. And what you see in this picture is a wall that was built to protect against coastal storms and sea level rise. But the designers forgot to consider that rainwater also needs to drain. And consequently, the project has created new hazards, floods. You can see that on the side there. So this is really important right now because more empirical evidence is available through many projects. We have far more knowledge about what's happening since the last 15 years. Also, through the UN Framework Convention process, which has just been critiqued, we also have in the Paris Agreement a need to be able to somehow assess how adaptation is progressing through this global goal on adaptation. And therefore, there's this tremendous pressure. How are we actually doing adaptation? And therefore, we also need to understand how to avoid maladaptation. And there are a number of different ways in which maladaptation happens. One of them is, as Nazia already referred to, an insufficient understanding of the vulnerability context and the social inequities that are in place where we are implementing projects. Furthermore, a lot of projects do very little critical analysis of or evaluation of long-term effects or potential positive and negative effects on other areas or groups. So we implement projects in contexts that we're not really familiar with. We don't necessarily bring in the local people who are supposed to be adapting to help co-design and co-implement the projects. And it probably isn't surprising then that they fail. So what we see is also just from a research and science perspective is that actually a lot of scholars are continuing to raise concerns about who is benefiting or burdened by these kinds of interventions, these resilience-building interventions. And even resilience scholarship itself is sometimes said to preserve the political economic status quo through a lack of analytical attention to the structural causes of socioeconomic inequality. And that, through this process, it normalizes vulnerability. And this is from a fantastic research done by Weissman and Fegan in 2019. So here we also have to bring in the fact that countries that started the colonial project continue to shape the global development agenda. And we've actually heard this, and the two previous speakers have referred to this in different ways, that those who are deciding on the agenda are not the ones who are the most affected. So for my final slide, please. So our approaches to addressing climate change must start with a whole of society approach, which refers to how governments, civil society, and the private sector make decisions. But this approach needs to be embedded in principles of equity and justice. And this is a figure here also from the Summary for Policymakers of Working Group 2. We are showing how we need to situate adaptation more holistically. And this requires considering interlinkages between adaptation, mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, and sustainable development. And in Working Group 2, we present this as climate resilient development. And this requires awareness of the values and ethics in play in the decision-making process. And what you see here is that every decision matters in moving us toward or away from climate resilient development. So decisions need to engage with these deep structural inequalities, biases, which we are, as researchers, are also responsible for upholding in the ways that we work. So finally, to conclude, how to do all of this with this rapidly closing window, that is the biggest challenge. And that's why we need to draw on experiences and knowledge across all levels of society in order to figure out how to fast track action. And that's essentially what climate justice is about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Schipper. And I guess now we could move very, very quickly to a Q&A in which, in response to all these excellent interventions, I can only ask, okay, so this is what we are dealing with. What do we do? What can be done now? So I request Professor Lee first, and then Professor Saito, and then Professor Schipper.
And I think we can turn off the slide. May not. Oh, you may turn off. Yeah, okay. There you go. All right. So I felt a little bit guilty to give too much kind of the gloomy the side, and somehow I just thought about some movies like settings like the carbon has become to some degree, it's become a weapon, like so carbon shinken shobu. So old samurai style, or the carbon may become a horror movie, and sounds like I know what you have emitted last summer. This is too gloomy, but actually that is not my message. My message is saving private climate, but not in a war setting, but much more in a creative and more fun setting. Okay. So regarding solution, my suggestion would be the one way will be the green pass system. Okay. Now there's a lot of the competitions are going on, the U.S. versus China, and the Europe versus others, etc. So, it might be inevitable to block all those carbon barriers, and actually to some degree, that might be one way to go. But on the other hand, we should be creative in making some green exception in the middle of very tough competition and political regulations. Okay, and for that kind of green path, the regulation should not, I'm not meaning loose, but it should not have a very kind of strict, the barrier style, the format. Rather, the voluntary markets. I may rather suggest the voluntary market, more voluntary driven. The voluntary market and the private sector participating mechanism should be more widely recognized. Then some people may say, well, that is greenwashing. They will cheat and they will make leeway. But then I will ask again, can national government, NDC, reach 1.5 degree goal? We do see a huge gap. Who will fill this gap? So, more private sector participation, more voluntary market scheme, and it should be creative in finding more certificate system. That will contribute, and that will be counted as the green asset and green credit. And then we will have more solution packet, okay, more gadget to deal with climate change. And which solution is the best? I would say more solution is the best. So developing countries, developed countries can work together. Korea, Japan can work together. Korea, Japan, China may work together in this kind of a lot more like transboundary, more private sector driven and more creativity driven solutions. So, and that will be one way to get out of the spiral of climate change geopolitics. So I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Okay. So I didn't have much time, but I wanted to highlight 2 points in my previous presentation. One is green growth is not possible because the decoupling, thanks to technological innovations, is not happening fast enough. The second point is that capitalism is a system of scarcity, artificial scarcity, that cannot rehabilitate commons because it's scarcity-driven, not abundance-driven. And that's why my idea of degrowth eco-socialism, it's kind of system of rehabilitating common, should be seriously considered as a radical alternative, which cannot be, of course, introduced so easily, but we still have to talk about possibilities that really go beyond our existing order of society and economy. And here are some concrete policies. Slide, please. Let me, sorry, I can't even see. So I wanted to give you some kind of rough ideas of what we do in order to achieve the eco-socialistic growth, where to begin. For example, we can ban private jets because, we don't use that. Who cares? But we can also ban short-distance flights, and we can also ban SUVs. We can also introduce maximum income, minimal income system in order to reduce the economic inequality, because the super rich are really responsible for this massive emission of carbon dioxide. And we can also consider introducing flight tax, meat tax, luxury tax for like sports cars and so on. But we can also introduce regulations on advertisement, planned obsolescence, and the model changes that are too rapid at the current speed. And then, in using these tax, we can spend more money on education, public transportation, bike lanes, and other eco-friendly care activities. And these are the measures that fundamentally challenge the infinite desire of economic growth under capitalism. And this is why green capitalism, the advocates of green capitalism, tend to marginalize these alternatives or these measures and instead talk about the great future based on the green technologies. But I understand that some people say, this is not something I want. So people often find degrowth is too restrictive and the loss of freedom and so on. But one point is that degrowth is not anti-technology. It's not going back to nature. But my point is simply that technology alone does not save the planet. We need to really reconsider this system of mass production and mass consumption based on the advertisement and the constant model changes and so on, because these are not something that makes us happier. Here comes the role of philosophy, because this is the topic of today, and this is why I'm invited, I think. So I want to highlight why philosophy is necessary in order to think about this problem of climate change. We can ask whether good life is possible, actually, through the decarbonization, technological decarbonization alone, if all other conditions remain the same. For example, if there is increasing inequality, stressful competition, gender inequality, endless consumption under the current capitalist order, even with the dream green technologies, we would remain quite unhappy. So here, philosophy can elaborate on what good life can actually look like by critically examining those concepts that we often take for granted, such as wealth, affluence, prosperity, abundance, and even the capitalist system, or money, and so on, and by redefining them in a way that is not compatible with continuing business as usual. Only then that the rehabilitation of the commons becomes something worth striving after. Otherwise, we think sharing something with other people would be inefficient and troublesome and so on. But by redefining what abundance actually looks like in the society that can, based on the free exchange of gifts and free communication and more equality, we can truly redefine our vision of the development. And I admit degrowth is a kind of utopia, but at the same time, the true utopians are those who naively believe that continuing business as usual will somehow save us from this coming catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Saito. Professor Schipper, to you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think to add to this, there are two things that I think are important to highlight. First of all, that transformation is coming no matter what. We can't stop the transformation that's happening. What we're trying to do at the moment is to make sure that that transformation of global society, of the planet, keeps as many of us alive as possible and keeps as many ecosystems alive as possible. I think this is, inevitably, there isn't much we can do to halt the changes. And so when we think about, for instance, climate resilient development as a kind of future paradigm, it is probably more of a conceptual approach to try to bring together different types of actions than an actual roadmap that we can lay out. And I think that the point about sort of different political philosophies, Marxism, socialism, degrowth, is really important here, because actually we need lots of different ways of thinking in order to be able to move ahead. Although I have my own political views, but I don't think that there is a single perspective that is going to be the solution. Therefore, it's that dialogue that is really critical, is that dialogue between different groups, different perspectives. The second thing I wanted to say is that the world was not good before we even started to notice climate change. There was a huge amount of inequality, there was a huge amount of poverty, a huge amount of unfairness, and that persists. And so what we're talking about now is not trying to maintain a world that was there before. It's about shifting things. And again, so this forces us to, when we think about this transformation that's coming, to really reflect on, are we centering this in these principles of fairness and human rights, human rights-based approaches? And do we put that first? Because we can't continue. And I think I would agree that this is partly where capitalism, for instance, is coming in and trampling on a lot of people. And we shouldn't accept that. I'm not sure there is any other single solution that can address it, but I do think that we need to keep these kinds of different perspectives in mind, and therefore we need this kind of continued dialogue and people to remain open-minded about critiques and discussions and so on. But at the same time, do it quickly, because we don't have that much time.
Thank you so much, Professor Schipper. We have had wonderful interventions from all our three panelists. In this panel, we wanted to outline the complexity of climate change. When we think of climate change, people may think, is it a development issue or a security issue, or is it a climate justice issue? And our three speakers have shown that it's all of it. And so in that sense, the kind of threats that we're facing from climate change are unprecedented. Also keeping in mind what Professor SCHIPPER said before climate change as well, we were living in a very deeply unequal world. And so what we need is a recalibration, if you will, of even basic concepts like what it means, as Professor Saito said, prosperity, what Professor Lee talked about, we need more and more solutions, we need cooperation, and then tying back to what Professor SCHIPPER said, more and more dialogue. So with that, I thank all of you, and I'm grateful to my three wonderful panelists. Back to you, Miki-san.
Thank you so much, Professor Hussain, Professor Saito, Professor Lee, and Professor SCHIPPER, for reminding us that issues related to climate change are extremely complex and are evolving at a very fast pace. Thank you very much.